Hello. It seems to me that so much of our maturity as Christians comes down to learning to trust God in difficult situations and to go on trusting, sometimes in the face of what seems to be the evidence. I want to tell you a story, and I'm going to tell it in two halves, one half in this week's newsletter and the other half in next. I want to encourage you, perhaps some of you will know the story and it won't have quite the same effect, although it's always encouraging to be reminded of it. But for others of you who don't know the story, I want to encourage you not to go and look it up and find out how it ends, but to wait. I think it could be a really interesting exercise to spend the week sort of calling to mind the story, knowing that it's unresolved and yet also trusting God for how it works out. This is a very real way that we can practice that maturity, that learning to trust God in the midst of our circumstances. And maybe if we can grow in that, we may also find it easier to learn to trust God in the ongoing uncertainty that we find ourselves in here. The story goes as follows. Back in 1921, a missionary couple called David and Svea Flood went with their 2-year-old son from Sweden right to the heart of Africa, to what was then called the Belgian Congo, now Zaire. They met up with another young Scandinavian couple called the Ericsons, and the four of them sought God earnestly for direction. In those days, there was much tenderness, devotion, sacrifice, and they really felt the Lord leading them to go out from the main mission station that they'd been based in to take the gospel to a remote area of the country. It was a huge step of faith that required them to depend on the locals, but at the village of Ndolera, they were rebuffed by the chief, who wouldn't let them go into his town for fear of alienating the local gods, and so they opted to go half a mile up the slope and build their own mud huts. They prayed and prayed for a spiritual breakthrough, but there was no spiritual breakthrough. The only contact with the villagers was a young boy who was allowed to sell them chickens and eggs twice a week. Svea Flood, who was a tiny woman, only 4'8", decided that if this was the only African she could talk to, she would try to lead the boy to Jesus, and in fact she succeeded. But there were no other encouragements. Meanwhile, malaria ran rife, striking one member of the band after another. In time, the Ericsons decided they'd had enough of suffering and left to return to the central mission station, but David and Svea Flood remained near Ndolera to go on alone. Then Svea found herself pregnant in the middle of the wilderness. When the time came for her to give birth, the village chief softened enough to allow a midwife to help her, and a little girl was born who they named Aina. But the delivery was exhausting, and Svea Flood was already weak from bouts of malaria. The birth process was a heavy, heavy blow to her stamina, and she lasted only another 17 days after the birth. Inside David Flood, something snapped in that moment. He dug a crude grave, buried his 27-year-old wife, and then took his children back down the mountain to the mission station. Giving his newborn daughter to the Ericsons, he said, "I'm going back to Sweden. I've lost my wife, and I obviously can't take care of this baby. God has ruined my life." And with that he headed for the port, rejecting not only his calling, but God himself. Within 8 months, both the Ericsons were stricken with a mysterious illness, and they died within days of each other. The baby was then turned over to some American missionaries, who adjusted her Swedish name to Aggie, and eventually brought her back to the United States at the age of 3. That's halfway through the story. There's some very real pain, there's some very real suffering, and there's a lot of loose ends. I wonder what it might be like for God to work in this situation. I wonder how we trust him in this situation. I wonder how those taking care of Aggie could trust her in that situation. I'll tell the rest of the story next week. But in the meantime, let's try to take this kind of conversation to God in the struggles that we have. And from last week's exercise, I realised that many of us are struggling day to day with all kinds of pressures from the current crisis we're in. Let's work through that exercise of saying, I don't know how this works out, but I am going to trust you, God. Have a great week.